Thank you guys for coming. I want to start off by thanking the organizers, ORF, Government of India, Earth Science Department, and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Arctic Circle for this amazing conference. It's a bit of out of our expertise mode, like at least biologists, but we want to make a point about that. One of the most amazing aspect of Arctic is its biological resources and all the adaptation that has gone into that. So I'm Neeraj. As I was introduced, I'm a Brankovic Fellow at University of Alaska Fairbanks and Salk Institute in California. I'm a neuroscientist by training, but I work on hibernating animals and try to understand how they reach those plasticity level of adaptations. As mentioned, this session is organized by SRM, UAAF, and Brankovic Fellowship, and we'll try to make a point that the biological resources are the most important aspect of things. So this is a time lapse I took a few months back in Tulik Field Station in Alaska. That's one of the premium US Arctic Research Center, and because of this we are able to do all the science we are able to. So want to encourage collaborations on using these resources and probably use UAF expertise to develop these field station across the world. So when you think about Arctic, we've heard for past 1.5 days that it's very important for shipping lanes, minerals, and all the resources. And of course, from scientific point of view, we've heard so much about climate change and the importance of melting ice. But the way we see it, I think the most important aspect is the biological resources of these animals and plants and microorganisms, how they have adapted to these changing environment. So there are around 21,000 species of animal, birds, fungi, fish, and microorganism in Arctic. They're all cold adapted. They show the plasticity of life. I'm mostly interested in studying hibernating animals, and one of the champion hibernator that lives in Alaska is Arctic ground squirrel. So I'm going to talk a little bit of science, but bear with me. This is a champion hibernator. It hibernates for 9 months a year. Its metabolism dropped down to 2% or 4% of its resting metabolism rate. Its body temperature become minus 3 degrees Celsius. So that's the only living mammal that can go below 0 degrees Celsius and remain in that state for 9 months. Its heart rate become 1 beats per minute. So normal during active season, it's like 400 beats. So for humans, it's like 60 normal beat. And when we run and stuff, it become 110 and 20. If you're at 1 beat, you're definitely dead. And it survives without eating and drinking for 9 months. It survives without defecation, urination for 9 months. You and I would be dead within minutes of most of these things, but these animals live, thrive in these conditions. And these are not frogs or snakes, nothing wrong about that, but they are our close cousins. They are warm-blooded mammals, and it tells you how plastic these systems are. And there are many applications of these things. For example, strokes and heart attack. These animals withstand the level of oxygen and blood flow, which is way beyond human would experience during the harshest of stroke. Millions of people die annually because of that, and I think the solution of these things would lie with studying Arctic animals. Similarly, organ transplant. Again, millions of people throughout the world die waiting for organs, and a lot of other people die due to traumatic injury or accidents. We can use those, but we can only preserve organ for very little time, few hours. These animals keep their organ at -3 for months. So there's a lot to learn about that. And these are the only example of living beings what we know of can dissolve the plaques formed during dementia, Alzheimer, and other neurodegenerative diseases. And hopefully this happened in my life. But if you want to do space travel, we would need hibernation or at least some form of that in our things. So this is our field station in Alaska above the Arctic line. It's a beautiful place. There are not many of that throughout the world, but we are able to do studies with these animals because we can go stay there. They're equipped with high-end all the equipments what we need to study genomics, proteomics, and neuroscience things. So I just want to give another aspect of the importance of this. These are two drug company, Ellen Lilly and Novo Nordisk. You probably have heard about Ozempic, anti-obesity drugs. Their combined market value right now is more than $1 trillion. Okay, that's more than the GDP of many of the Nordic countries what we know of. So it's also from economic point of view and startups and biotechnology point of view. These are remarkable resources. We have it with us. We should use it for try to form collaborations where we can understand these mechanisms, and I hope we come together on this platform to make it a reality. So yeah, in Ozempic, it was also discovered from a non-model organisms called Glia monster in Mexico. So that just tells you the potential of studying these extreme adaptation in these animals can have long-lasting effect, and biotechnology and startups as well. So we've assembled a strong panel of 6 panelists who work on different aspects of these physiological adaptation in Arctic and third pole. And first we have Larry Hinsman. I think most of you know him. He's right now President's Professor at University of Alaska Fairbanks. He's more than 35 years of experience studying hydrology and meteorology. He was the former VC of research. He was also former assistant director of polar research in White House, and shaped many of the policy decisions for doing collaborative research between the Arctic Circle countries. So thank you, Larry, for being here. We'll look forward to hearing more from him. Then we also have Robert Coker here. He's a deputy director of Montana Center for Work Physiology and Exercise. He studies extreme physiological adaptation in humans in Alaska and in other Arctic places. He's done Yukon Arctic Ultra, that's a ultra marathon, where it's almost like a survival situation for these people when they participate in these kind of things. And Robert studies human adaptation in that, what kind of changes happen to your physiology when you're going through these extreme physiological changes. He has more than 25 years of experience in human metabolism. So 25 years is not his age, right? That's his experience. He looks young, but that's the number of years he's put into this research. Then we have Nandini Rajamani from IASCR Tirupati. She works with cold adapted species in Trans Himalayas. So we know very little about these animals who live in these high altitude. They're very hypoxic, very cold, and yet they survive and thrive. So she studies the ecology and adaptation of these animals and their behaviors in those heights. So thank you, Nandini. Okay, next up we have Vice Chancellor of SRM Institute of Science and Technology, Muthu Chelvansar. SRM, some of you probably would know, it's one of the leading scientific research institute in India. It has more than 100,000 students, 37 campuses, 267 MOU with foreign institutes, and 4,200 active PhD students. So this is almost like magnitude more than most of the universities you'll hear about. And 4,000 is frankly population size of many of the small towns in and around Arctic. So they've assembled a pretty large cohort of PhD students doing cutting edge science in different fields. Then we have Melinda Coker. She's a research assistant professor from University of Montana. She works subsistence farming in Alaska, hunter-gatherer lifestyles, and what are the metabolic changes and health benefit of Arctic foods. And she also studies, she's just published a very nice paper on sex-specific adaptations of these extreme physiological thing. And she probably would have something cool to say about how women are actually stronger and not the other way around. Then we also have Alison Keller. She's the first Indigenous Alaskan from Nome. I don't want to butcher the name, but Koyukon. She's the first MD from there, and she brings in a very unique perspective about bridging Western science and Western a way of treating with local and ancient traditions of Alaskan Native people. And she's also championed many of the decolonization of health and environmental justice movements, and integrate the technologies from medicine and healing practices. So with that, I'll start the panel discussion. I want to thank all the panelists again for making this long flight and coming here for discussing the polar thing. So. Okay, Larry, I want to start with you first. You have an extensive experience, 35 years of hydrology in Arctic, in Alaska, and you've collaborated with your peers in Canada and Russia. So from this long-term perspective, what have you learned about the hydrological or ecological changes that are happening in Arctic? And what can we learn from those findings about third pole, the changes that we're going to see or we are already seeing in the third pole, Himalayas?
Well, thanks, Narasha. First of all, thank you very much for having us here. I think it's a wonderful opportunity. We've had a great visit. We're very appreciative of our hosts, and so thank you for all of these arrangements and for the wonderful discussions we've had so far. The Arctic ecosystem is actually a very fragile ecosystem, and as you know, as you move farther north or south into the more extreme environments, the ecosystem diversity actually decreases, and so there's incredibly unique animal and plant species there, but they're very attuned, very adapted, they've evolved to fit the system that they're in. With the changing environment, we're actually seeing some range of that exceed the experience or exceed the adaptability of the species that are there. For example, as we see the permafrost thaw a bit, that changes the surface hydrology just enough. It doesn't have to, the permafrost can thaw 1 meter and the surface will become so much drier. It's relatively low precipitation there in the summertime. So it becomes so much drier that the plants just cannot survive. And so when we get a little bit of change in permafrost, we see a substantial change in hydrology, which means we see a substantial change in the vegetation that can survive there, which then affects the animal species. And so we see an immediate cascade of impacts and responses. And so it is such a fragile environment that it's not just the plants and the animals, but also the societies that survive there. The rainfall is relatively sparse, and so the communities that survive there thrive on a very tenuous water supplies. And so it's very similar in many respects to what we'd see in the Himalayas. As far as you lose the permafrost, the system changes, and it just creates a cascade of consequences for the animals, the plants, and the people who do survive there. And so it's a tenuous environment. And I will stop there.
Cool, thank you. I want a follow-up question. I want you to wear your policy hat now. You've been involved in these collaborations, international collaborations, policymaking at the highest level. So what suggestions would you have for people who are sitting in this audience and us? How do we form these newer collaborations, multinationals, where we can study these extreme physiological adaptations, not only in Arctic, but in Himalayas and maybe in Arabian Peninsula, where it's a different kind of stress. It's a heat stress, but the comparative thing would bring out a lot of amazing knowledge about it. So what is your suggestion? How do we start off forming these kind of collaboration, or what worked in the past?
Yeah, great question, and it's very important for researchers to think about as they're trying to help our societies deal with the challenges that are on our immediate plane and on their horizon, in that we can't move into these communities and say, we're here to solve your problems. What we have to do is we have to work with the communities and understand what they need to have done. And that may be individual cities, or it may be environments such as the military or business or industry. We have to understand what they need and work with them rather than for them to try and develop these solutions to the challenges they're dealing with. And the other thing is it's very difficult at this point in where we are in the science today and in our policy. It's very difficult for single disciplines to resolve any of these challenges that are facing so many of us. And so it's important to build the teams that you need to go after these solutions. And oftentimes what that means is working across university systems with business and industry and across borders, across nations. Gather the expertise, go to where the expertise is, and work with the various units to build those collaborations, utilize that expertise, utilize those resources, utilize their platforms, utilize their insights and their efforts so that we can build a collaborative partnership to address these challenges.
Yeah, so for my research particularly, Tulik Field Station has been instrumental. That, the kind of infrastructure that exists and the kind of things you can do, it's just unimaginable, right? Like, to bring those animals back. What role do you think UAF can play? Because they've been operating that field station for 50 years. So if we need to develop something similar in, say, Ladakh in India, or maybe in Arabian Peninsula, so what kind of leadership role would UAF would be interested in leading these kind of collaboration, or transferring at least the skill set of how to manage that? I want to say that, I love Tulip for one more reason: how sustainable it was. Like, what, like, how you shower, how everything was so well managed, because there's no exit. Like, everything need to be hauled away. So it's also a sustenance model. Like, what can other countries learn from that?
That's an excellent point. In that, so I've been there. So Toolik Lake was established about 50 years ago, and I started working there about 4 years after it was established, and it grew slowly, and so it evolved and adapted along with the science and the capabilities that we needed, and so it's a wonderful place for individuals to come and to learn about field stations and to see how they're developed, how they're managed, how they're utilized, and how they work to support the scientists and support and be responsive to the problems that they're trying to address. That field station was the model for the Cambridge Bay field station, which is called the Canadian High Arctic Research Station. Before the Canadians established that station, they actually came to visit us in Alaska to discuss what are the capabilities that you need, and what are the best approaches that must be developed to make a successful station that can persist and be of value for many, many decades, be sustained for many decades, and be responsive to the communities, utilize the resources that are available, but then again give back to the society that is supporting them. So it's a wonderful resource, and I think that one of the things that we have done at the University of Alaska is, over the years, we've helped start many research careers by bringing people to this station and then teaching them how to work on their problems, how to adopt it, how to use these instrumentation, how to use the resources, how to operate in these extreme environments. They go back to their homes and establish their own research stations. And from the benefit for us is that we then have these long-term collaborations that can last a lifetime. And so it's a benefit to the individuals that visit, but it's a benefit to the researchers who help start those careers. These lifetime collaborations just pay off immensely for everybody.
Just one last question on that. Do you think UF would be interested in leading some of those collaborations, or because you're involved in still policy at UF, do you think UF would be willing to lead some of these initiatives?
Oh, certainly, and that's what we've done for many decades. So absolutely, I think it's it's beneficial to everybody. We love helping students get started. We love helping launching careers. We thrive on establishing these relationships and building these partnerships. And so certainly we welcome everyone to come and visit us, and please contact me and I'll help you establish those partnerships.
Cool. All right, I'm going to move next to Robert. Robert, you've done some remarkable work on studying these athletes and adventurers in Alaskan winters, like Yukon Ultra and this other one, the Alaskan Wilderness Ski Classic. Those are really survival situations, right? Like, the temperature is minus 30, minus 40 degrees Celsius, and they're running around. From your experience, what was some of the most remarkable things, what you saw in terms of physiological adaptation in those humans? I've been there. I took out my gloves for like 10 seconds and I thought I'm going to lose my hand. So, and they're same humans. They're not even close cousin. They are humans. So like, what are those findings, or what have you understood from?
Well, thank you, Neeraj. You're very kind. I appreciate your words, and appreciate the opportunity to come here and participate in this Arctic Circle Indian Forum. And thanks also to the hospitality of the Indian people here. It's just been fantastic. To answer your question, we've basically found what I think are three pillars of physiological resilience, and those are centered around adaptations, hormonal adaptations, cardiovascular adaptations, that are also linked to psychological correlates. And that was a little bit unanticipated to some extent. And for example, not to deep dive into the science too much, but in particular, we found that increases in leptin, which is a hormone that influences satiety and that type of thing, tended to be associated with poor decision making. In the Arctic, that can be life-threatening. Whereas neuropeptide Y, or increases in neuropeptide Y, were associated with increased resilience and better decision making. And so the point is, the interactive relationships between those three pillars don't exist in a vacuum on their own. They're connected to each other. That's one of the things that we noticed that we found to be the most remarkable. And the other thing I'd like to also kind of dovetail into something that Dr. Hensman was talking about is, I spent almost 10 years at University of Alaska Fairbanks and then went to Montana. We tell everybody we moved to Montana to thaw out after 10 years in Fairbanks. But the point is, there was an opportunity there and we took it. Nevertheless, the 10 years at UAAF, even though we didn't spend really much time at Tulik, it allowed Cherie and I to be able to understand some of the challenges associated with living and, in this particular case, thriving in an environment that can be extremely challenging, and where the margins for error or the margins for survival are much smaller than what you might have in a thermoneutral environment.
Okay, to follow up on that, would you be interested in studying or designing some of the studies to, because there are people who are living at 4,000 meter altitude in Indian Himalayas. It's very cold, hypoxic. So do you think there would be adaptation happening there? How about warmer climate or really hot climate, right? Like, deserts. Would you be interested in designing some of those kind of studies and working collaboratively, people who are here?
I'm very interested in that, and for a couple of different reasons. One is that most of, when I was talking about the pillars of physiological resilience, we're studying what are basically acute adaptations. We haven't studied the differences in chronic or acute versus chronic adaptations, and I think that in and of itself would be very interesting. In other words, people that are living in an environment as opposed to those who are visiting that environment. That would be, I think, a provocative comparison. The other aspect of, to answer the other aspect of your question, to be able to study physiological responses and cold exposure layered on top of altitude stress would be interesting as well, and to see potential differences between the two could shed some new light on how to. I think you mentioned some. Most of our work right now is really applied towards military and operational resilience in the military. So answering some of those questions as to how to best prepare people for training courses or operational stressors would be interesting.
Yeah, that was actually my next question. I know you work very closely with U.S. military, and I don't know how much you can say on those things. If you guys have some secret pills which you're giving Marines, so there are practical ramification of these. Like, once you study these adaptations, you could do that for either for sports or making soldiers more resilient and adaptive endurance. But can you talk something about that your work with U.S. military and translating these things? And also you're an entrepreneur as well, so you're very interested in translating these findings and discoveries into actual products.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing about working with the military is I've learned in particular much more about the dynamic nature of our planet, and a lot of the relevance to the dynamic nature of the planet at this particular meeting is on climate, but it also is very relevant to the military. I noticed this morning, they deliver the nice newspaper to your door every morning in the nice little bag. That there's, I think 40 years ago there was a conflict, Operation Megadut. There was a conflict between India and Pakistan, and kind of taking control of the Siachen Plateau. And that was the highest, or known as the highest and coldest military conflict to ever take place. Yeah. And now there's increasing tensions due to a terrorist attack several days ago in that same region. And so these things continue to be, or continue to have operational relevance when it comes to the military. In other words, the military looks at basically three tenets of operational effectiveness, and that's survivability, sustainability, and maneuverability. And so those can be very, very challenging in an environment where you have limited resources due to the remote nature of it, not to mention just the environmental stress layered on top of that. So to answer your question, I think it would be a privilege to work with international partners to try to help understand some of the predictors of resilience under those circumstances. And the other thing is basically how to develop stress inoculation strategies to help people be more effective.
Cool. I think I'm going to go. Also, one more thing I want to mention. So there are actually startups that are coming up from the discoveries and technologies what we observe from these animals. There's one which is trying to extend the golden hour, at least in the military conflict. It can be applied in civilian context as well, during traumatic injuries, accidents and stuff. So you have very limited time where you can save someone. This metabolic suppression, what happens in these hibernating animals, can really change that and survivability in battlefield or in civil conditions. So again, these are adaptations. These animals had millions of years to adapt. These are our assets, so we should use those. Okay. Next, I'm gonna go to Nandini. Nandini, you work with trans-Himalayan species, small mammals living above 3,500, 4,000 meter above sea level. Extremely hypoxic conditions, 11% I assume oxygen concentration at those levels. And tell us something about pikas and mammoth. What have you learned, and some fascinating aspects of their physiological adaptation?
Yeah, thank you, Neeraj, for inviting me to this panel, and thanks to UAAF and the Arctic Circle for coming to India. This is an exciting platform to be at. And yes, we do some work in my lab in the Trans-Himalayas, where we study small mammals, mammoths, pikas, but we also study brown bear and hangul, and look at how these animals adapt to these extreme environments. And some of the things we found, kind of in parallel to what the glacier people were talking about in the last panel, that there's enormous diversity across the Himalayas. Just as there's glacial diversity and diversity in ruggedness and terrain, the biotic diversity mimics this. And it was a bit of a surprise to us that we found that animals seem to evolve in really small pockets, regional pockets. So the Trans-Himalaya is not one uniform place or landscape. Species differ in altitude and in microhabitats across this region, even with just a few species. We also find that they have very unique adaptations and sometimes very different adaptations from each other. So if you go to a meadow and you see like 3 species, they're not all going to respond the same way to the same winter. They have different breeding cycles, they have different strategies for adaptation. Some hibernate, some stay out all winter and store food. The others maybe just don't even store food. So it's pretty fascinating to see this kind of diversity. And I also want to comment that while there are so many similarities between the Arctic and the Hindu Kush Himalaya, there is one major difference in my opinion. The Hindu Kush Himalaya is one of the 20 global biodiversity hotspots of the world. And this is a massive landscape with enormous elevation profile. And species diversity here is amongst the richest in the world. And in the Trans-Himalayas, we see so many species that are so uniquely adapted. So it's been an exciting journey.
Okay, so I think next thing I want to ask you about those, you answered sort of comparative between Himalayas and Arctic and probably warmer climate. So building on that, would you be interested in studying, or if these kind of opportunities arise, would you be interested in conducting similar studies and exploring? Because most of these animals, I was in Vietnam a few weeks back, and they have these amazing primates, and all we know is their name. They're endangered or not, nothing about their physiology. And we could design all the experiment we want in mice, but some things might be already solved by these animals. So would you be expanding your horizon to these kind of collaborations, and what do you envisionize on those kind of collaborations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And most definitely, comparative studies are the way to go, especially if you want to understand species adaptations. Studying a single species is not really going to give you the kind of insight that studying a whole family or a whole suite of species will give you. And so, studying different species in cold adapted zones like the Arctic versus the Himalayas certainly are insightful. And we do some of that analysis with genomics already.
Mhm.
But to be able to apply this to other fields would be even more exciting. I've worked on ground squirrels in Canada for a postdoc, also extremely cold,
Yeah.
but very different from the Arctic or from the Himalayas. So very different environmental conditions cause differences in physiology. And we're trying to look at physiology in the coming year and hopefully some collaborations across outside of evolutionary biology.
So some recent study that's been coming out from, I think, UCSF and Stanford on hypoxia as one of the treatment for many of the neurodegenerative diseases, and but we don't have model system to study that, and I think you're in very unique position in studying these animals. Do you also see practical outcome from these things? Not only just as scientists we love abstract things, but actually physical tenable outcomes from studying these.
Absolutely. I think that's where it gets exciting, that we can use these learnings from species to understand ourselves or help ourselves. Like we understand the evolution of the EPAS1 gene in animals that helps them with mobilizing extra oxygen at high altitudes. And then we start to see it in human communities across the world. So there's tremendous relevance from studying wildlife and applying it to humans.
Yeah, we did talk about a little bit about AI effect on aspects of things. I just want to mention that these are already done experiment on planet Earth. So we have animals who've adopted in Arctic. We have animals who've adapted in Himalayas. You do certain just observation studies, and then you can use AI to figure out what are the actual changes and what are the commonalities. So this is like Venn diagram overlaying and giving us answers about what has happened on there. And then I also want to ask, you're doing all these things without a field station, right? It's very challenging. I've been to Ladakh many times, not for science trips, but for leisure. And I know it's very tough environment there. And with all that constraints, you've done remarkably productive science. So what would be your wish list for making a permanent field station, maybe taking inspiration from Tulip Field Station in Alaska? You can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think ecological studies are critical and they give you real world insights, which are difficult to simulate in the lab or with modeling. But to do good ecological science, you need a good field station because that is where you live. And we do work for long periods of time. And our longest stints are months long, 6 months long, and we're in hypoxic conditions. And so without a field station, we do have field stations, we stay somewhere, but we keep moving camp.
Yeah.
And so to have a really nice dedicated field station that can work for biology
With
would be
equipments.
incredible.
With equipments, right?
Absolutely.
A field station, not like putting tents, but actual equipments. You can actually do science there, and a huge opportunity for collaborative work. Students in different universities can come and do stuff and move around, and I think could be great for the whole Arctic thing. So next I'm gonna go to Mutamil Chelvan, sir, Vice Chancellor of SRM Institute. So your institute is massive in size, with hundreds or more than 200 MOU internationally. You're leading already a lot of these initiatives for establishing international collaboration. So what do you think institute like yours with 4,000 PhD students, expertise in nanotechnology, computer science, and every aspect of things, what kind of resources you can bring to conduct these kind of research, and what are your broader interest in Arctic research?
Thank you, Neeraj. SRM Institute is committed to climate action and international collaboration. It is very much built into our system. To give an example, in the year 2011, 55 students from different disciplines, along with the faculty and with the support of Indian Space Research Organization, designed, developed and launched a satellite which with the objective of measuring the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So that was our first attempt. It was successful. Now our interest is little more focused towards the research in Arctic or polar research in general. The main reason for venturing into that is, you see, in Himalayas, the human habitation is more. plant animal diversity is huge, and therefore it's absolutely necessary to have a look at that and see what is happening in the Arctic region, and if we can extend that to the Himalayas. Though we don't have any direct research exposure, but I think we can bring in a lot of technical capabilities to understand what is happening. For example, over a period of time, we have developed capability in biodiversity studies, climate modeling, AI-based environmental monitoring, and then satellite-based remote sensing. So I think with these capabilities, we can see what sort of findings that we could see in Arctic region and extend that to the Himalayas. Our main concern is the climate refugee and the loss of biodiversity. So with that in focus, we wanted to move ahead. We also have what is called a Center for Research in Environment, Sustainability, Advocacy, and climate change. We do have that, where we are focusing on the environment basically and the sustainable development goals. We focus our research on water, then the air pollution and the environment in particular. So having some sort of collaboration with University of Alaska and other like-minded universities, I feel that we can augment our capacity to move into Arctic research.
I also understand, SRM is building a new dedicated center for excellence for these extreme physiological adaptation in both non-model organisms and humans. Do you want to tell us something about that? I know it's in final stages. We've been talking about that, but do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Since we have done substantial research under the REACH, under the Center of Excellence REACH, we are in the process of creating a Center of Excellence for extreme physiology adaptation. Our main focus should be on the human, plant, and the animals and how they survive in the extreme conditions. Some of the researchers from the University of Alaska are mentoring our students to see how the brain function varies with the extreme conditions. I think that's moving in the right direction, and if everything goes on well, in the coming 6 to 7 months, 2 of our students will be visiting University of Alaska to understand better. So once they come back, we'll build the capacity and then work on the other research focused areas.
Also, I think you did touch upon a little bit, it's a huge intellectual assets you have with more than 4,000 PhD students. Would you be interested in, joint PhD programs or exchange students so that PhD people who enroll in polar research in SRM can conduct their thesis in Arctic and vice versa?
Yeah.
And one more put in that, sorry, that and also if we are able to get enough attention here and be able to make a field station in Himalayas, that would be, SRM could lead that kind of initiative, and then there would be 2 field stations studying similar kind of extreme physiological things between species across the globe.
Yeah. So after attending this conference, I feel that a lot of importance should be given to polar research. I think our first step should be popularize this polar science in the university. That's the first step that we are going to do. And the second one is to collaborate with like-minded institutions. Now, once we popularize this polar science program in the campus, I think more students will be interested, and at least about 50 to 100 students, PhD students, will be willing to take up research in this. Now, I understand that establishing a field station is very difficult and costly. Anyhow, we have that in our mind, and if like-minded institutions come up, we are certain that we will have one in Himalayas.
Cool. Thank you. All right, Cherry. Melinda. I'm going to go next to you. You work on subsistence of Alaskan native population and hunter-gatherer lifestyles. Share something about what you've learned about from their nutritional perspective and how what can we learn from those.
Okay. First, before I start on the science, I'll just use yours then, I guess. So first, before I start on the science, I just want to say thank you to Niraj for inviting us, and to the Arctic Circle Forum for allowing us to speak about our topic and to have interest in our topic. That's really exciting to me. My husband is Dr. Robert Coker. I am Melinda Cherie Coker. I've gone by Cherie. This is why there's so much confusion. My whole life I've gone by Cherie. But in science, you know, we all go by our first names. And so it's Melinda. So in scientific context, that's the name I use. And it's confusing, a bit confusing for a lot of people. But again, thank you so much. And so let me get back to our science. You know, we have the ability as a team. We work in very extreme environments, harsh environments. For example, it was minus 57 degrees Fahrenheit at the start of one of our Yukon Arctic Ultra races where we were studying those participants. And so another one of the things that we did is we studied backcountry hunters. And that may not sound like much, but you know, these hunters are dropped off in the middle of nowhere with only what they have on their back. Hundreds of miles from the nearest road in really harsh environments. Both temperature and terrain is very harsh to navigate, very difficult. And they're out there for a couple of weeks. So about 14 days is the length of those times. And what we found when we studied those people is that they kind of mimic the indigenous populations when they're on these explorations. They're moving about 16 hours a day. There's a movement constancy, which is something the elders talk to me about in the indigenous populations that's so important. And this movement constancy is not at a high level. You know, it's a moderate movement constancy all day long. And another thing they're under is a nutritional stress because they can only take so much food with them and they don't have the caloric input that they need on these trips. And these populations generally consume a lot of wild fish and game in their home areas as well. And what's important about that is the wild fish and game has an essential amino acid combination that is more anabolic in producing human muscle. And I actually did a study on that I think Niraj will ask me about here in a moment and we'll talk about. But for right now, I'm talking about you, and I'm talking about every human on the face of this earth. I found this incredibly interesting when I wrote the paper on this study. We have been involved in a hunter-gatherer lifestyle for over 300,000 generations. Let that sink in. The number of generations that we've been eating processed and ultra-processed foods is 3 generations. So our bodies, we've not had time to adapt genetically to these changes. And that's the reason we're seeing so much chronic disease. We see these metabolic dysfunctions. We see the inability to cope also familially because we don't operate in the same way we did as hunter-gatherers. Our genetics, no wonder we've got all these problems because we just haven't gotten there yet biologically. And that applies to everyone in this room and every human on earth. And I find that so interesting. And here, I've heard so much talk about climate change and shipping lanes and economics and military issues. But what I haven't heard a lot of talk about is humans. And it's humans that have to deal with all of these changes emotionally and physiologically. That's why I think it's so important that we study humans as well as all of the other things that we're studying, because we're the link, we're it. We're what provides answers. So I really want to make one point, and I want to make sure I say it correctly. But I think what we need to do is we need to kind of align with that movement constancy of our ancestors. We need to rethink our food quality and our food consumption and preparation. And we really need to go back to a more effortful living style.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. I'll get back to you, but I want to bring in Alison on the same point. You represent. First of all, thank you. I have to appreciate you, and I have to tell everyone that you flew 30 hours for half a day to attend this thing, and you're leaving tonight. So really, really appreciate. And you're probably the only indigenous Arctic person, at least I've seen till now. So we really appreciate your presence here. And you also, integrate something very unique, a medical doctor by training, but also deep understanding of traditions of healing from the native culture. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you integrate that and how, or some example of concrete example about the outcome of those?
Sure, happy to. When integrating traditional practices, it's important to know that those do not exclude Western medicine. So traditional American Indian and Alaska Native medicines have been used to contribute to modern science and modern pharmacology for years. And so I would say that they're not mutually exclusive, and it's important to know that traditional knowledges are based on practices that include our own types of science. Sometimes the sciences are more circular rather than linear. I hope that helps.
Yeah.
Nancy?
Yeah. Also, you've done work on highlighting high rate of preventable diseases in these native population. What lessons have you learned about those, and would you be interested in studying similar kind of stuff? Because I think we've heard many times there are 200 million people, or more than 200 million people, who live on these Himalayan slopes. Very similar kind of extreme weather. Would you be and cultures also develop very similarly, using the herbs to treat themselves. Would you be interested in forming or studying those kind of things as well?
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense to study them in relationship with the people and to build those longitudinal relationships over time and to maintain them. We've found that people tend to participate in studies longer when we have local people that are involved in them and folks who are really longitudinally involved in our communities, such as the folks that you've met here. So building on those trusted responsibilities and also listening to the people regarding the types of medicines that they use. So for us in Alaska, one of our first medicines is berries, and we found that blueberries are particularly helpful, not only for cardiovascular disease, but also for cerebrovascular disease and for heart health and brain health in general. So about a third of a cup, about a handful of blueberries a day can be helpful to not only prevent dementia, but also in some cases to treat dementia. So that would be our medicine that was used as a tonic. So in our medicines, we would use medicine to prevent disease rather than only treating it.
Cool. I think we can open the floor for some questions, and I want to thank all the panelists for making comprehensive point. And I hope you guys are convinced at least a little bit that biology is an important aspect. Okay, I'll go there.
Hi, so I'm actually moderating the next session, and I'm aware of time, so I'm very briefly. This is directed at Dr. Melinda specifically. I found it really interesting that you say that we've only been eating the foods that we're eating for 3 generations, and then that's causing chronic illnesses. And I completely agree. My question is, given the rise of population in the world, I think it's really hard to sustain natural sources of food. So we hear a narrative, for example, that farmed fish is better, or like genetically grown food is going to be better because of the science behind it, et cetera, et cetera. But still, whole foods are different and our bodies react differently. So I'm just wondering, and I'm curious, how long would it take, even just from your insights, to adapt physiologically to this shift in food sources? And if that's even possible, and if it's not, how do we kind of strike a balance considering the future we're going towards? Thank you.
May I go ahead? That's a very interesting question, and I will tell you, I'm not a geneticist, so I don't really know, the answer to that question, but I can tell you some things that might be helpful. One of those is, we did a study on wild free-range meat compared to commercial meat. And we did that through isotopic methodology. Interestingly, I was told no one would participate in that study without being paid because it was a difficult study where they sat for 8 hours on 2 different occasions with infusions and blood draws coming out of each arm over a period of time, and they couldn't eat. And so it was a difficult study, but I want you to know that people are so curious, just like you are, as to how our food affects us, that I had a waiting list, and it shocked everyone. And the answer to that question was that when both of the meats were studied together, protein synthesis in the human was the same, and that shocked me because I expected the amino acid profile of the free-range meat to improve synthesis. But the interesting thing is what it did is it allowed 50% greater suppression. And so the net protein balance, like your bank account at the end of the month after expenditures, the net protein balance after consumption of the free-range meat was 50% higher. And that's not important if as a bodybuilder. What that means is if you consume free-range meats, you have a 50% greater chance of maintaining muscle as you age. You start losing muscle at age 30. And so you want to maintain muscle and avoid frailty because frailty can lead to death. And you've all seen that in family members, elderly family members, I'm certain. So it's important that we try to find food sources, whether natural or processed, that have the appropriate range of essential amino acids that our body needs to consume in order to maintain our muscle and keep our resilience, because that's what we all want in every population is resilience. Thank you for your question.
Okay. I think this is probably, I think they said no question, but we can interact after okay. Yeah, but I think it's an excellent point to end that, findings and studies in Arctic can have ramification for global health. Like, Alzheimer, dementia, it doesn't have any country, right? Like, we argue about the nation states and we can make all those arguments, but these things are beyond that. And these are our joint inheritance, as you say, that, of biological resources. And I hope like we all collaborate on trying to understand these things and develop technologies that can improve life of everyone throughout the world, Arctic or non-Arctic countries. So thank you all.
Thank you so much.